I would like to thank the organizers of this year's meeting for the invitation to speak, and I hope that I can shed a little bit of light on the medical evidence. Before talking about the x-rays, I have a couple of stories to tell, and pardon me if you've heard these before. This picture was taken in 1975, and that's me sitting next to an older gentleman. This was my first time flying from Little Rock to Dallas, and I ended up sitting next to this very talkative man, and he kept on railing about his mean SOB brother Lyndon. Finally, I asked him if he was talking about President Johnson, and he said, "Who the hell do you think I'm talking about?" This was Sam Houston Johnson. There's a lot more behind the story. He had a problem with alcohol abuse, and I found out that Johnson had him institutionalized for a few months during his presidency. As a longtime Democrat, I didn't want to think that Johnson could have had any role whatsoever in the assassination. And I still don't see him as being one of the organizers or planners, although I absolutely believe that he had a prominent role in the cover-up. He was probably going to be kicked off the ticket in '64, and he may have been caught up in legal trouble with the Bobby Baker scandal brewing, so he would have been a prime target for blackmailing to cooperate. The second part of this story is about one of my favorite patients who died several years ago. His name was William Ashley, and he was retired from the Air Force. He was a gunner on a B-17 over Germany, and after the war, he went into Air Force Intelligence, the OSI. Before I even became interested in the assassination, we would meet for coffee. I would meet him for coffee, and he'd tell me stories about the war. He spent much of his career in West Germany trying to catch the enemy setting up honey traps for the airmen. In 1963, he was stationed at an air base near Dallas. So one day I asked him if he knew anything about the assassination, and his face went pale. I was afraid to ask him anything else. On another day, for some reason, we ended up talking about LBJ, so I asked him if he thought LBJ could have been behind the assassination, and he just laughed. He said, "No, he wasn't smart enough." I'm convinced to this day that Mr. Ashley knew something, but these guys took their oath very seriously, and he never told me what he knew. Speaking of President Johnson, this is Johnson urging Senator Richard Russell to participate in the Warren Commission shortly after the assassination. This is a question that has a good many more ramifications than on the surface. We've got to take this out of the arena where they're testifying that Khrushchev and Castro did this and that, did that, and check us into a war that can kill 40 million Americans in an hour. Now imagine that you are the Bethesda pathologist performing the autopsy, and you're given this scenario by your commanding officer in order to avoid any discussion of a shot from the front. What would you do? These X-ray images we'll be looking at were placed in the report of the House Select Committee in '78, and the autopsy photos were copied by James Fox and later sold to a researcher, and now you find them plastered pretty much all over the internet. As you can see here, Robert Kennedy didn't want to give up custody of the autopsy x-rays and photos, but he was forced by federal law to turn them over. They're stored in a classified section at the Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland, and access is very strictly limited. I was fortunate to receive approval from the attorney representing the Kennedy family for the deed of gift. I had a total of 3 visits to the archives in College Park and 2 visits to the Presidential Library. I've seen the original skull x-rays only once, and my request to view them again have been denied. They were in excellent condition. It took me several months to locate the 1960 skull x-rays. The staff at the Presidential Library were very helpful, and they finally found them, and they had been mislabeled as sinus x-rays. The lateral skull x-ray from 1960 was in excellent condition, However, the AP film had deteriorated badly due to exposure to the elements. The Bethesda pathologist said that there was a single bullet entry in the skull at this area of the right lower occipital region, with an exit somewhere in this vicinity in the frontal parietal region. The Clark panel and the House Select Committee moved the entrance way up here in the parietal bone with an exit at this precise location. And again, on the posterior view of the skull, you can see the Warren Commission entrance and the House Select Committee designated entrance, which was first proposed by the Clark panel. And on the left, this illustration from the Warren Commission report, you notice that they had to dramatically exaggerate the forward flexion of the head at the time of Zapruder frame 313. They moved this back wound up to the neck. Oh, it's actually down around T3 in the upper thoracic region. And then the House Select Committee illustration would have us think that all of this bone was intact. All this area, the temporal bone, occipital bone, and this area, the parietal bone. So why did the Clark panel and subsequent panels change the entry location? It's because they couldn't make sense of the evidence. The trajectory from the Skullback depository 6th floor didn't fit the Warren Commission scenario. There should have been an exit through the face. The x-rays did not show a fragment trail from the lower occiput to the proposed exit. They thought that the x-ray showed a possible entry much higher than the Warren Commission entry. The autopsy photographs did not confirm the Warren Commission scenario. There was no demonstration of an entry wound in the lower occipital scalp. And, most importantly, the brain photographs revealed that the cerebellum was intact. An entry at the Warren Commission location should have caused massive injury to the cerebellum. This is from the House Select Committee report. If you carry their trajectory and apply it to the Warren Commission entrance, then you show where you should have had a blowout in the face. Here we have Dr. Petty of the House Select Committee medical panel questioning Dr. Humes. Dr. Petty, well, we have some interesting information in the form of the photographs of the brain. And if this wound were way low, we would wonder at the occipital lobes. And here the cerebellum is intact, as well as the occipital lobes. And this has us concerned right down the line as to where precisely the in-shoot wound was. This is why we found ourselves in a quandary. One of the reasons that we very much wanted to have you come down today. The skull x-rays were taken after the head was unwrapped, but before the official autopsy had begun. How many skull x-rays were taken that night? Commander Ebersol, the radiologist on duty, said there were 5 or 6. Corpsman Gerald Custer said there were 5, an AP, 2 laterals, and 2 obliques. And then Corpsman Edward Reed said there were 2. When the Clark panel took an inventory in 1968, they said there was 1 AP and 2 lateral skull films. So these 4 images, 2 original and 2 enhanced images, were placed in the House Select Committee report, and these can be purchased from the archives. This is my replication of the cut-off lateral film as viewed at the archives. When you look at these skull x-rays, most of what you see is the skull bone, but we have other tissue that contributes to the image, the scalp, the dura, or the lining of the brain, which is very thick, and then you have the brain itself and the blood and spinal fluid. Now this is from the original AP. There's a massive amount of trauma to the right side of the skull, even loss of skull bone extending over to the left, fractures extending over this way to the left, fractures, then a large bullet appearing object here. So we're going to be covering this in more detail. Next, when we look at the lateral skull x-ray, you're getting a composite of both sides of the skull, as well as the brain itself and the other tissue mentioned. Now, this lateral original image doesn't appear the same as the film that I saw at the archives. The film, you could see more of the cervical spine come down much lower. You could see the facial bones. This area of the skull wasn't as dark. You could see more of the skull base, including where the pituitary sits, the sella turcica. You could see a lot of just numerous, very tiny metallic fragments here and up in this area, and you just don't see any of that on this image. Now, there is one lateral skull x-ray at the archives which is cut off in the back part here, and again it extended much lower. You can see more of the neck and it wasn't as fuzzy and dark up in this area as you see on this image. This is the computer enhanced image of the AP x-ray in the House Select Committee report. It's not quite the same as the enhanced film, which I saw at the archives. The image placed in the report is much brighter. You can see much more detail of the heavily fractured frontal bone here. You can see the outline of the frontal sinus. You can see the outline of two burn marks over here on in this area. On this lateral enhanced image, you can see more metallic fragments up in this frontal region, but you still can't see the numerous tiny fragments that are seen on the original at the archives. Now you can see the sella turcica, which houses the pituitary. I was asked to give specific reasons why I wanted to view the x-rays at the archives. So in my request to former Senator Paul Kirk, who was the attorney for the deed of gift at that time, I listed two reasons. One was to measure the sella turcica, and because it appeared to be enlarged to me. It turns out that it may be slightly enlarged. It was at the upper limit of normal. I couldn't measure it on the AP film because it was too fractured to measure. The other reason I gave was to take optical density measurements of the film to see if Dr. David Mantik's findings could be reproduced. You can also see on this lateral, you can see the pencil lines drawn in by Dr. Ebersol on the night of the autopsy. Notice this long fracture and this one here. I'll show later that this fracture is actually situated on the left side of the skull. These two fractures converge back here toward the Warren Commission entrance site. This fracture stops when it encounters one of the long fractures. And then this is a subtle fracture, but it's definitely present, and I'll show later why this has to be on the right side of the skull. So we've got some missing skull just anterior of this fracture. Notice you can see that bone flap that overlies part of this area. This area has been called the white patch, and this bone flap barely overlies it. So what did the Warren Commission report say about the x-rays? This is it from the autopsy report. X-rays of the skull reveal multiple minute metallic fragments along a line corresponding with the line joining the above described occipital wound here and the right supraorbital ridge here. As you can see, this is a bald-faced lie. I don't know any other way to put it because all of the fragments are way up above that line. There are some probable fragments right here, but nothing in between. For the Clark panel, we had Dr. Russell Morgan, chairman of radiology at Johns Hopkins. He interpreted the x-rays. He said that on one of the lateral films, there was a hole measuring 8 millimeters in diameter on the outer surface, and it can be seen approximately 100 millimeters above the external occipital protuberance. He said the metallic fragments visualized within the right hemisphere fall into two groups. One group consists of relatively large fragments, more or less randomly distributed. And then he said the second group consists of finely divided fragments distributed in a posterior to anterior direction in a region 45 millimeters long, 8 millimeters wide. He says, as seen on the lateral film, this formation overlies the position of the coronal suture. Its long axis, if extended to the back, passes through the above mentioned hole. So this is what he was calling an entrance, and what basically you're seeing this portion of the skull is overriding this portion. So it doesn't appear to be a hole by any stretch of the imagination. He says this fragment trail appears to end anteriorly, immediately below the badly fragmented frontal bones, just anterior to the coronal suture. So this is the approximate location of the coronal suture, and he said it extended just anteriorly. Actually, it extends all the way to the frontal bone. And this is again Dr. Morgan in 1977. This was while the House Select Committee medical panel was reviewing the x-rays and the medical evidence. And I think he most likely was told that they would be releasing these images in the report. So this is an interview by a Michigan newspaper. He says, and since the examination 9 years ago, Dr. Morgan said he's having second thoughts about what kind of bullet hit the president. He says the fragmentation was so severe that one had to wonder if it was a so-called dum-dum or hollow point bullet. Then he goes on to even suggest that exhuming Kennedy's body might answer some questions about the nature of the bullet fragments. For the House Select Committee, we had two radiologists who interpreted the x-rays. Dr. David Davis from George Washington was in general agreement with Dr. Morgan's interpretation, except he had difficulty explaining that large bright fragment seen on the AP film. He thought that this large fragment is outside the intracranial space. Presumably this represents a metallic fragment in the scalp, although this cannot be accurately determined from this particular examination. Then G.M. McDonald was the radiologist who oversaw the enhancement of the x-rays, and we'll talk more about him later. He went along with the interpretation that this alignment of metallic fragments was associated with an entrance here and an exit up in this area. He commented that there appeared to be a fragment embedded in the scalp. This is a couple of centimeters below this area designated as the entrance. Next, we have Dr. John Fitzpatrick, a forensic radiologist from Cook County in Chicago, who looked at the x-rays for the ARRB. He said he couldn't identify an entry wound on the AP x-ray. He said he'd never seen burn marks like the two artifacts on the AP x-ray. I certainly agree with that. He also said he could not identify an entry wound on the lateral x-ray. He said there was no object which directly corresponded to the bright 6.5 millimeter wide object on the AP x-ray. When I presented these images to a group of neuroradiologists and general radiologists, they all agreed with that statement. He said there was a snow trail of metallic fragments on the lateral skull x-ray, which probably corresponds to a bullet's track through the head, but he could not tell whether it was back to front or front to back. He continued to be disturbed and puzzled by the fact that the large 6.5 millimeter object on the AP x-ray could not be located on the lateral x-rays. He opined that the 6.5 millimeter object on the AP skull x-ray looked almost as if it had been machined off or cut off a bullet. And again, this is the so-called 6.5 millimeter object, and there's nothing corresponding to it on the lateral x-ray. Here we have the lateral original compared with the pre-morbid 1960 skull x-ray. So this is how they took the AP x-ray. The film would have been underneath the head. The angle of the x-ray beam was off. It should have been at this angle, and it was off by about 15 degrees. It's pretty easy to calculate how far they were off. This is a rough approximation of how the lateral can be compared with the AP. If you adjust for that angle, and you can see how this fragment trail lines up with this fragment trail in the far upper portion of the skull. This bright object is in the vicinity of this object embedded in the scalp, and I'll show later that I think you can see, David Mantic first noticed this, and I think he's right. You can see this smaller, much smaller object within the diameter of this object here. Next, I want to talk about the x-ray evidence for an entry in the upper right forehead region. Before going to the archives, I was very interested in taking a closer look at this area. This part of the frontal bone is the right side of the frontal bone that had detached from the rest of the frontal bone, and it had actually fallen back and somewhat into the cranial vault. So this is the area that I wanted to take a closer look at, and there had been reports that there wasn't a wound in the upper forehead. It could have been an entry wound. I wish that these x-rays were digitized before they're lost to the effect of aging. I've made requests, a lot of other people have made requests to the archives that they digitize these films, but so far we've not been successful. It'd make it a lot easier to better examine these fine details. So regardless, I took a closer look at this area with a 2x and a 10x magnifier. So notice these two bulges on the inner side of the frontal bone. We're going to take a closer look at that area. So this is Basically what it looked like on the lateral original at the archives, you could see a lot more, actually too many to count, tiny metallic fragments in this area. They had to be bullet fragments, they had to be metallic because they were so small they would not have shown up if they were bone fragments. You have these, this looks like two metallic fragments there, but they're strange looking because they're flat on one side and rounded on the other. I'm still not sure what to make of that. But then there's a gap in the bone, and just on the inner side of this gap there were several tiny metallic fragments here. Again, remember that this part of the skull bone was originally in this area, so it collapsed backward and downward into the skull vault. When a bullet strikes the skull and disintegrates, there are multiple factors which determine how far these fragments would travel into the tissue, including the size, location within the bullet, the contours of the skull, the density of the soft tissue, and many other factors. This is from a study performed after World War II by the Army, looking at the penetration of various size spheres into gel, all fired at the same impact velocity. And as you can see, the larger spheres traveled the furthest, with the smallest barely penetrating the gel. So it would defy physics for a shot to impact the back of the head, but deposit all of these tiny fragments only on the opposite side of the skull. This is an example of gel ballistics of a 9mm hollow point frangible bullet striking the medium here and disintegrating in. You can see the larger fragments traveling the furthest, and the smaller fragments are scattered here close to the entry. So again, we're talking about this location in the frontal area. I thought that this was interesting. This is, again, the original image from the House Select Committee report. The original is viewed at the archives, and then the enhanced image from the House Select Committee report. So these larger fragments, notice what happens with them as the image was somehow modified before placing it in the report. The top fragment blends in with the bone. The lower fragment becomes this bulge. And then this area where the tiny metallic fragments were noted is now covered up with this lower bulge, which also extends and obscures this gap in the bone. Now this is taking the image from the computer enhanced image from the report and just adjusting the brightness and contrast, and you can see as the bulges melt away that you can see their location in relation to this gap in the bone. This is G.M. MacDonald, the radiologist, in a national advertisement from 1963. In '63, he had just left active duty in the Army. When he was picked to enhance the X-rays or to supervise the enhancement of the X-rays for the House Select Committee, he was in private practice in LA and also teaching defense medicine at UCLA. In the 50s, he was the Army medical officer in charge of animal nuclear toxicity testing during Operation Plum Bob. He supervised the computer enhancement of the X-rays at Aerospace Corporation outside of LA. It is a quasi-governmental corporation which provides scientific assistance to various government agencies, including NASA, Department of Defense, and CIA. Dr. McDonald was not necessarily the person responsible for adding those two bulges on the inner side of the skull on that image. However, these could have been done by anyone associated with the placement of these images in the House Select Committee report. Again, this is just a rough approximation of how I think that the lateral can be viewed in relation to the AP X-ray, and you see this fragment trail here. I think the counterpart here is all clustered in the upper part of the skull. I think that this fragment here is probably this one embedded in the skull, but it's well below this area. But this is well above this 6.5 millimeter object. And this is a close-up of that area on the AP X-ray. And this is the area that we're talking about on the in the upper right forehead. I know this is difficult to look at for non-medical people, but it helps to understand these wounds. This V incision here on the forehead helps to orient what you're looking at. The photographer was focusing on the interior of the skull at these fragments. At the archives, I could see eyebrow and eyelashes here. So this is the forehead. This wide fracture was pointed at the right frontal region, high frontal region. And I think it was produced by an entry up here in this location somewhere. You can see contours of the skull. When they retracted the scalp, Hume said that they had fragments fall off the scalp, so the entire loss of skull was not this big, but when they pulled the scalp back, we had a lot of fragments that fell to the wayside, and some fell into the cranial vault here. As you can see, President Kennedy had a full head of hair. And I think the shot would have been in this location, approximately. It may have been more laterally or more toward the midline, but it was somewhere along this location. These are some witnesses to seeing a wound in this area. Dr. Charles Crenshaw at Parkland, a general surgeon. Then Joe O'Donnell, government photographer, said he was shown photographs by William Knudsen, White House photographer, from the autopsy, and he said that there was a hole up in this area that measured about 3/8 of an inch by his estimation, which is about 9 millimeters. Thomas Robinson with Galler's Funeral Home saw the body at Bethesda, and he also saw something up in this location that he thought was about a 1/4 inch in diameter, which is about 6.3 millimeters. Dennis David, hospital corpsman at Bethesda, also placed a lesion or a hole up in this area. And then a witness much later said that he'd seen some photographs taken by someone or shown him by someone associated with the government that showed a bullet wound up in this area. I think that that there was an entry in the lower occipital region, and that was the first shot that impacted the skull, causing these fractures that weakened the skull. And then when the frontal shot hit, this expanding temporary cavity exploded out the top of the skull through the weakened skull, and that would the head was tilted forward, so it would cause the ejection of bone and brain matter in this direction because of the tilt of the head. Next, I want to talk about X-ray evidence of a wound, either an entry or exit wound in the right temporal bone. Here you can see the temporal bone and how it relates to the occipital bone and the parietal bone. This is something that I did notice at the archives, and I wish that I'd taken a closer look at this area during my first visit. I noticed it later when I was trying to correlate what's seen on the lateral view with the corresponding area on the AP view. So we'll be focusing on this area inside the red circle. You can see this area better on the lateral original. Now this area I think was artificially darkened out for this image in the report. I would like to go back and look at the original, look at this area closer. There is a smooth defect in the bone that you can see most of it. And when we get up here, it's the upper portion of this defect is covered up by this bone flap, this big fragment that was sort of mobile. There are a couple of fragments. I could see 3 fragments on the lateral image in this area. So this is a defect in the bone. There's missing bone, and then this V shape in here I think is a soft tissue lesion inside the margin of this bone defect. Here's a closer look at that area. You can see the horizontal pencil line that Ebersol drew on the film. You can see the grid lines. With under different brightness, I can make out some bone fragments. Here's an oval appearing fragment here, one here, possibly there. Again, you can see the grid lines. The grid was used to try to sharpen the image, so these are normal. Then the smooth contour of this bone defect, and it's got a lip. I'd call this a lip on the back side of it, and that's important. Then you've got this, I think this V shape is some type of lesion in the either the scalp, the dura, or both. So it's a soft tissue lesion. And just again, what I think are probably small bone fragments at the periphery of this area, and we're going to see a lot more of those when we look at this area on the AP view. So that bone defect in the temporal bone has some characteristics of a keyhole defect, which is produced by tangential strike of bone. This article by Berryman showed the stages in the formation of a keyhole defect. Again, keyhole defects are associated with tangential strikes to the bone, and they can be produced with either an entry wound or an exit wound. This is reported of an exit keyhole lesion. Notice the configuration of the lesion in the scalp. With adjustment for brightness, you can make out these ovoid looking fragments a little bit better. And again, the contour of the bone defect, and inside that the contour of the soft tissue defect, and we lose the contour of the upper portion of this bone defect because of this bone flap that's laying over the top of it. Now we'll focus on this corresponding area on the AP image. And you can actually see this area better on the original images than you can on the enhanced images placed in the report. So this is the area we're going to look at on the AP. So now we're comparing this area with the corresponding area on the left, and you can start to make out multiple bone fragments in this area. Just above here is the larger of the burn marks, supposedly made by Ebersol as he was looking at this film under the hot lamp. So I hope you can see all of these. There are just multiple. There must be over a dozen at least bone fragments around this area. So we know that only 2 or 3 are directly in the vicinity of that bone defect on the lateral view. So I think the rest of these are scattered on a plane going back toward the temporal occipital part of the skull. We just don't know how close they are to the that bone defect seen on the temporal bone. So we'll see how they look as we adjust the brightness of the image. Now these are not bright enough to be metallic fragments. You can see they're of the density of bone. Now these have the appearance of metallic fragments. There's something else that I noticed in that area that I would like to point out. First, when you have a bullet strike the skull, the radiating fractures develop and they spread rapidly across the skull. And then second to form are concentric fractures, or also called heaving fractures. On my last visit to the archives, I was allowed to look at the House Select Committee enhanced X-ray film again, and I noticed these fractures. There's an arc appearing, or concentric fracture, and then this radial appearing fracture here in the lateral frontal area. So there was bone in this area. A few comments about this photo. This autopsy photo shows the V-shaped incision on the right side of the forehead. And we have multiple Parkland Hospital witnesses who said that this was not seen there. The area of the right temporal wound is in this area. The scalp had been pulled back for dramatic effect for this photo. This bone flap was mobile and was folded back for this photo. In one of the back of the head photos, or more than one actually, I think you can see it directed more laterally and slightly forward. Now this whole side of the scalp was somewhat mobile, and a lot of these bone fragments were mobile. At Parkland, Dr. Gene Aiken, anesthesiology resident, reported seeing a bullet wound in this area. Many of you have probably heard Dr. Don Curtis talk. He was an oral surgery resident at Parkland, and he's reported on what he saw in the emergency room. He said that his chief, Robert Walker, told him the following Monday morning that he did see what appeared to be a bullet hole in the right temple, and he said he well knew a bullet hole. And these oral surgery residents at Parkland saw quite a bit of trauma, as well as the general surgeons. At Bethesda, Jim Jenkins was the hospital corpsman, one of the hospital corpsmen assisting the pathologist, and he remembers a bullet wound in this area. He said it was roundish with grayish margins. If his memory is correct about the gray margins, then this would imply that it was an entry wound, since gray margin is what is called bullet wipe, as the soot of the bullet is left imprinted on the skin or scalp. Now, when I viewed this stereoscopic photo at the archives, I saw an oval, depressed area that appeared filled with blood. I could not see any gray margin or see much other detail on that photograph. Next, we'll look at the X-ray evidence for a right lower occipital entry. The Bethesda pathologist said there was an entry in this location near the midline. You don't see that area of the occipital bone on this image, which was cropped. So their location of entry here would have been just to the right of the midline, and it would not be able to be seen on the lateral because it's that part of the skull is perpendicular, and it would be lost in the surrounding bone. Now on the AP, unfortunately, because of the way the X-ray was taken, we wouldn't be able to see it because of the overlapping facial bones and teeth. Now this area of the lower occipital region is very blurred and indistinct on the original images. This is the negative image of the back of the skull. Notice these two fractures that appear to converge toward the location of the Warren Commission entry. And then this is the designated entry location for the House Select Committee. And notice here is that fragment embedded in the scalp, a couple of centimeters down from this so-called entry location, which I think is just overlapping skull. So if there is only one shot that impacted the skull, how did this fragment, if there was only one shot and it entered here, how did this fragment migrate through the scalp up to this location? Or if the House Select Committee was right and there was only one shot that entered here, how did it migrate downward to this location? Now, we're going to talk about how these fractures intersect and the implications. Again, you can see this overlapping, the bone flap that overlaps this area, which is the white patch, which appears dark on the negative. Let's call this long fracture, fracture 2, and this shorter one, fracture 1. According to Poupé's rule, when fracture 1 stops when it encounters fracture 2, then this means that fracture 2 formed first and fracture 1 occurred later, because the fracture cannot propagate over an open space. So this would go along with the first shot hitting the lower occipital region. I think this fracture was formed by a later shot, and I'll show how this is actually situated, crosses the back of the skull toward the left side. These long fractures are actually on the left side. Now, this squiggly line here is the lambdoid suture, which separates here the occipital bone from the parietal bone. And on his pre-morbid X-ray, you could see both sides overlapping, both lambdoid sutures overlapping. On the autopsy X-ray, I could only see one. Now this is the original, comparing the right side and the left side. There's a lot of missing tissue on the right side, probably a combination of both skull and brain tissue. I saw this photograph at the archives, and this whole area down low had a very, very strange appearance. It looked like, to me, it had been painted in. Now this blob of tissue looked to be genuine when I was able to get a better look with the on the digital images from the ARB. It had a little vein running through it, and it looked real. This did not look real to me. I want you to notice one thing. Notice where the cowlick or the whorl is on the left side of his head, and it looks like it's in the midline on this back of the head photograph. I was not allowed to view this one because it included wounds below the head. I was only allowed to view the x-rays and photographs pertaining to the head wound. Here's that shallow wound that is at the T3 or T2 level, but it's certainly not in the neck. Now I'd like to briefly discuss the brain photographs. This is Kemp Clark, chairman of neurosurgery, who later became president of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. In his typewritten statement of November 22nd, he described a large wound in the right occipital parietal region. He said that both cerebral and cerebellar tissue were extruding. Then in his sworn testimony for the Warren Commission, he made a point of noting that the loss of cerebellar tissue would probably have been of minimal consequence in the performance of President Kennedy's duties if he had survived. This was well before we knew that the cerebellum has a lot more to do with brain functioning other than coordination. This is Marion Jenkins, who described the wound as more over the temporal and occipital area. He said there was cerebellum protruding from the wound, and he saw fragmented sections of brain on the drapes of the emergency room cart. This is Dr. Robert McClellan, associate professor of surgery at that time. He said that probably a third or so, at least, of the brain tissue and posterior cerebral tissue and some of the cerebellar tissue had been blasted out. One of my friends trained in general surgery at Parkland, and he always marveled at Dr. McClellan's photographic memory, and he said he was one of the best teachers that he ever had. I can imagine that a lot of these Parkland witnesses had a tremendous amount of pressure placed on them to change their story. Some of them either went into hiding or they moved toward the official version of the wounds. But Dr. McClellan didn't budge. He was consistent over the years. I think that Doug Horn has proven that there were two brain examinations, one 2 to 3 days after the assassination and the second about a week later. Dr. Pierre Fink, Army pathologist, attended the second brain exam. The brain photographs in the archives are undoubtedly of the brain which was seen by Dr. Fink on that date. Note here what he says about the brain specimen. He said no metallic fragments are identified. And this, he says, the convolutions of the brain are flat and the sulci are narrow. That can mean one of two things. It could mean that there was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, which can take days to develop, or it could mean that there was pressure on the external surface of the brain hemispheres, causing flattening of the surface of the brain. Now there are two views of the brain, at the archives, one dorsal and one of the undersurface, ventral. The left hemisphere appeared very distorted and swollen. And initially I thought, well, this brain has been some type of pressure on it as it's been laying in a jar. But I've thought about it over the years, and I think it could be one of two things. It could be the effect of cerebral edema, which takes at least 12 hours to see that type of swelling, and usually it takes days for that kind of swelling to develop after any type of head injury. Or it could be pressure effect of a hematoma, a subdural or epidural hematoma. There was subarachnoid blood. There was bruising on the undersurface, the basal, frontal, and temporal lobes. If you put all of this together, you have a classic description of a head injury, a severe head injury. It would not have been difficult to obtain a brain of someone who died from a head injury in that time since autopsies were routine. Now, on the ventral side, the temporal and frontal lobes were bruised, and the cerebellum was completely intact except for a tiny little fovea which was hanging loose, but there was no hole, there was no bullet wound, there was no significant trauma anywhere seen on the cerebellum. On the left is cross-section of cerebral cortex, and on the right is cross-section of cerebellum, and it's a very delicate, distinctive appearance to the cerebellum. To summarize, the brain photographs at the archives cannot be of President Kennedy's brain. The cerebellum showed no damage except for a tiny fovea hanging loose on the left side, no damage whatsoever on the right side. This constellation of findings on the photographs is a classic description of the pathology of a closed head injury. I believe that Dr. Kemp Clark and all of these other physicians and nurses knew the difference between cerebrum and cerebellum. And John Stringer, the Navy autopsy photographer, testified under oath to the ARRB that he did not believe the brain photographs from the supplementary brain examination could be the photographs he took. I want to encourage you to read Doug Horn's description of this whole escapade of two separate brain examinations. Next, we'll briefly talk about deception and manipulation of the x-rays. This textbook by Cahoon describes how x-rays were copied in the early 60s, and you could see how it would be easy to alter these images through the process of copying. This article from 2019 in the Washington Post is pretty frightening. It shows how easy it was to fake cancerous nodes on CT scans, tricking radiologists reading them. First, we'll look at the 6.5 millimeter object seen on the AP film. This is a close-up of that object, and this is David Mantik's drawing of the object from one of his visits to the archives. I agree completely with him that this was added to the image. You can see the outline of a fragment within the diameter of this object. Actually, you can see more than one. It was incredibly dense. It was more dense than all of President Kennedy's fillings combined. No one at the autopsy at Bethesda reported seeing this on the autopsy x-rays the night of the autopsy. They were completely puzzled why they couldn't find any bullets or large fragments of bullets on any of the x-rays. When David Mantik talked with Dr. Ebersol by phone, he asked him, "Did you see any big bullet fragments at all in the skull x-ray?" He said, "No, nothing big at all. No, the bullet did a typical thing. It smashed into hundreds of pieces." Now, when he came back and asked him about this specifically, Dr. Ebersol ended the conversation. And I agree with David Mantik about this, that fragment that you can see within the outline or the interior of this object is most likely this smaller fragment embedded in the scalp. Next, we'll look at the so-called white patch. On this lateral original image, it's sort of hard to see. Then if you take the lateral original and adjust the brightness, it starts to stand out more from the background. This whole area here, and then this skull fragments overlying just one edge of the white patch. And this compares the negative of the 1960 skull x-ray. Look at this area, and then this is the negative of the computer enhanced image from the report. And now comparing it to the negative lateral original, and you can see the outline. Now the lateral computer enhanced positive image compared to this 1960 X-ray. David Mantig, with his background as a physicist, came up with the idea of using the optical density of these X-rays to show how the white patch and also the 6.5 millimeter object were outside the realm of what could be expected to occur naturally. Now these optical density readings are logarithmic, and they measure the amount of light transmitted through the X-ray film. It's been used for a long time, or it was used for a long time for quality control of X-ray film. A reading of 0.3 shows twice as much light transmitted through the film as a reading of 0.6. So on the left are the optical density readings that I took on the 1960 skull X-ray, and what's important here is to compare similar regions on this X-ray with the autopsy X-rays. So we compared the densest portion of the white patch with the densest portion of the petrous ridge. This petrous bone or petrous ridge is the densest part of the skull and is almost all bone at this level going across the skull. So if you take that ratio on the 1960 X-ray, you have 0.29 over 0.49 gives a ratio of 0.59. Now, David Mantig took optical density readings on multiple control X-rays and looked at this ratio, and this ratio from Kennedy's 1960 X-ray was exactly what you would expect to see. It filled right in with the controls. If you look at the autopsy skull X-rays, this white patch was incredibly dense, and the ratio on the left, or this cutoff lateral film, was 0.32 to 0.24 is 1.33, which is way out of range. I want to look at one other thing on the lateral X-rays. This fracture, this subtle fracture in this parietal area of the skull, it crosses this long radial fracture. So these fractures cannot be on the same side of the skull. Here you can see it with the close-up extending across this fracture. So they have to be on the opposite sides of the skull. This is frame 317. We're going to take a little bit closer look at this area. So the edge of this opening on frame 317 appears to closely match this fracture, which is actually the edge of bone here on the lateral X-ray. So this area, I think, was missing bone in this region on the right side of the skull. So this area on 317 looks genuine to me. This area does not. If you've seen Tom Whitehead's and Sidney Wilkinson's Reef Zapruder video that they showed at the Kappa meeting a few years ago, I think you would be convinced that this black area was added to Zapruder frames to obscure the big blowout in the rear of the head. Now, early on, Dr. Robert Grossman, the neurosurgeon, described this, and he said that there were actually two areas, two wounds, with one being a large wound at the back of the head, and then this smaller wound in the temporal parietal region. I think he altered his story in later years to go more along the official version of the wounds. Dr. Kenneth Sawyer was also a neurosurgery resident. He was on the left side of the table, and from his viewpoint, he described the wound as being more temporal parietal, and I think he was describing this. I think most of the people at Parkland missed this because Jackie folded this a flap of scalp back over this area. She talked about doing this. I think it was in one of her testimonies. Now, I don't think all of this is that flap. I think just a small portion of it is. You've got all of this stuff going on at the front of the head, and in later zapruder frames, it looks really bizarre. And I think this was artistry. What I think they were trying to do was divert attention away from the back of the head, from this gaping wound, and direct your attention to the front of the head. So why did the Clark panel and the House Select Committee medical panel, except for the brave and lone dissenter, Dr. Cyril Weck, why did they change the entry location? The trajectory was off. The x-rays didn't show a fragment trail from the lower occiput to the proposed exit. They thought that the x-ray showed a possible entry much higher than the Warren Commission entry. The autopsy photographs did not confirm the Warren Commission scenario, and the brain photographs were not compatible with the Warren Commission entry. There are too many problems with the Clark panel and House Select Committee scenario, however, to list them all. First, the Bethesda pathologists and other observers didn't see an entry wound at the House Select Committee location. Their scenario does not fit with the description of the wounds at Parkland, and also the description by multiple observers at Bethesda. The fragment embedded in the scalp at the House Select Committee entry location is more compatible with an exit wound. The pattern of intersecting fractures argues against an entry at the House Select Committee entry location. And an entry at this location does not explain the fine trail of tiny fragments at the opposite side of the skull. The Clark panel and subsequent medical panels could not reconcile the conclusions of the autopsy pathologists with the x-rays and photographs, so they tried to develop an alternate scenario which would fit the evidence. They assumed that the brain photographs were of President Kennedy's brain. They assumed that there was only one headshot, and they assumed that the autopsy photographs and x-rays were genuine and unaltered. I think there is strong x-ray evidence of an entry in the right frontal region, x-ray evidence to support an entry in the right lower occipital region, and strong x-ray evidence of a wound in the right temporal bone of entry or exit. The evidence simply doesn't fit a one-shot scenario to the skull. It leaves us with the two-shot scenario or a three-shot scenario. With the two-shot scenario, entry one was at the lower occipital region, probably fired from a lower elevation than the 6th floor of the school books depository, with an exit here in the temporal bone, with entry 2 high in the forehead causing the blowout at frame 313. Question is, would there be enough mass left in that bullet for an exit at the back of the skull to eject the Harper fragment and to splatter the policeman riding on the motorcycle behind the limousine? Doug Horn and David Mantic think that there were likely 3 shots that impacted the skull, with the first an entry in the lower occipital region. Now, what happened with this bullet, we don't know if there were 3 shots. It could have been embedded at the skull base and removed before the start of the official autopsy. Then the second shot would have been in the upper forehead, causing the blowout at 313. And the third shot most likely would be at the temple and exiting at the back of the skull, causing the large blowout in the back of the skull. Finally, for what it's worth, this is what all of this means to me. The medical evidence shows that a cover-up began on the very day of the assassination. Although I'm like a lot of other people who think that President Kennedy was a victim of the Cold War, killed by our own people, there's still much that we don't know. For me, it's important to separate what happened 59 years ago with what is happening today. We're in pretty bad shape in this country right now. I've never seen so much hatred. We still have bad actors, both within and outside the country, trying to tear us apart. I can't blame the people working in our government institutions today for something that happened 59 years ago. And I think that we can still support them while at the same time working for truth and accountability.